Carlos Henriquez, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
I have been a fan of your playing for such a long time, and whenever we see each other, we always end up talking about strings and bow holds and strings and like all of these really string geeky things.
Dirty stuff, I know.
But just to put us in context, so we're running with the Benedetti Foundation, we're running a 3-week session on looking at the foundations of our physicality and our psychology when we're playing instruments. And we are addressing from the most beginner level, so really young kids that are just starting out, but also we have a lot of adult learners, so people who are just starting to play but that are in their older years, but also a lot of conservatoire students as well, and a whole range of people studying different styles of music, but predominantly classical music. And we thought that it's just super interesting to get the perspectives of incredible musicians like yourselves. Do you feel you can generalize for us your approach to playing your instrument, both from a more physical, tactile sense, and then from a more kind of, you know, your mentality before you play, whilst you're playing, whilst you're practicing? Just give us some thoughts on both.
Well, I think that's a great question, right? So I think, and I'm talking presently, since I've been doing this now for a while, I think, yeah, it becomes more generalized because we, as professionals, I think have a certain tunnel vision of what sound and direction we want to go. So yeah, I think, when I'm practicing or playing, I think there is a type of, generalized, physicalities, a psyche going on, trying to, trying to reach that goal. And it's all internal, right? It's all happening in the brain. The brain is going berserk, right? Because it's listening, it's trying to put things together. But at the same time, I think it's trying to match that certain love that you've created towards a certain, I guess, sound, a certain phrase, a certain something. And as a young musician, that changes. So you can't, I think personally, I don't think you could generalize it too much because it changes for younger musicians. One day they'll sound like this person or they'll want to be like this person. And the next day they get a new bow, they get a new bass, and all of a sudden now they want to sound like this other person. So I think as they grow musically, it becomes more general because you want to stick to that tunnel vision goal that you're trying to, receive towards the end, what you're trying to get. So,
yeah, absolutely. And I think our, like you're saying, those early years are so much about trying to find your identity, and a lot of the time you're sort of piggybacking off of a lot of different things that you hear. I mean, God, I remember so many hours, I don't want to say wasted, but spent, just trying to emulate this one and copy this one and copy that one, and eventually you settle into this way that is your way.
And it becomes who you are. But you got to, you got to stumble through all that. And it's, I've always said that it's almost like a relationship, right? Because, and I always describe this in jazz, we tend to learn the art form historically by imitating. I mean, it's the only way you can learn the music. I mean, yeah, we have talent. We'll create things in the middle of how we adapt to learning, right, from others. But you get so in love, right? You fall in love with this musician that you want to sound like and be, that at a certain point in your life, you're actually gonna have to break up with this person sonically, right? Because if you don't, it'll just put you in a pigeonhole. People will just say, "Oh, you sound like so and so," "Oh, this person's a great copy of so and so," and it might be a good thing, but at the end of the day, musically and historically, we know that many of the greats have created their own sound through trials and tribulations. So this is, this question is very crucial because once you get to a certain proficiency level, right, that generalization that you have, with your psyche and your physicality has to be on point. It's the only way you could continue, getting that hole in one in golf, always hitting 3 pointers in basketball, hitting home runs. It's that same niche that you got to hit, so.
Absolutely. In terms of like technique, let's say, if we kind of isolate technique a little bit, and can you take us through a little bit of your path, because I know you are an amazing guitar player as well. Can you take us through a little bit of your path in building your technique, and how much of that was imitation or like a strict study, and how much were you creating your own way of doing things?
Well, so as a young man, when I was about 12, 13, I was a classical guitar player. I studied that in my public school, actually in my intermediate school here in New York, in the Bronx. And it was a one-on-one lesson. It was interesting because they called me the sponge, because the teacher would teach me something and I would quickly pick it up, like really fast. So that was my early training of technique, just seeing what he was doing and me picking it up real fast. And for me, I could say it was very informal, right? Because after a while, I was able to go to Juilliard for these Saturday programs that they offered. And then I slowly started learning, the ways of, okay, this is how you play the classical guitar. I started seeing Sharon Isbin, this other gentleman by the name Dante Rositi, who taught me how to play. And then things got a little bit more formal, right? But through technique, at a young age, it was really, I would say for me, it was psychologically complicated, right? Because at a young age, you don't tend to understand how much that's valued, right? Because it's almost doing the same thing over and over again, and it's about trying to refine a craft. And when you're young, I mean, the last thing we want to do is to try to clean and refine something, right? We don't have the patience for that. So I think through the trials and tribulations at a young age, I was able to maybe refine it, but not knowing that I was refining it. I remember one time, as a classical guitar player, waking up in the morning, and all of a sudden, I just got this thing about, I'm gonna play a chromatic scale, but I want to play it super fast and clean. I must have been 13, and I just woke up with this thing like, I got to do this right. So then I started doing it slow, and then I started feeling the pain in my arm. I was like, oh man, this is some work. It was like, this don't feel right, but I started learning then that through technique and through practice, right, you have to, it will enable you to get to that level that you want to get to. So then when I switched to bass, which I switched during my Juilliard studies, I mean, I was already playing bass in the background, but I really focused on it more seriously. It was the same situation. It was technique was something that had to be refined, especially with instruments that create physical complications. And especially the upright bass. It looks great, holding something that big and playing, but I guarantee you, and I can tell you, that it does not feel 100% well all the time, especially the amount of times that we're doing it, because we're on stage a lot and we're performing a lot, right? So the technique issue was something that as I got older, I had to refine. And it was something that you had to engrave in your head and feel, right? It's something that you have to kind of feel the technique and also know when you hit the sweet spot, and always keep that spot going. Because if not, you either hurt yourself or you change your technique and then you start creating bad habits. It's crazy. And then once you create bad habits, it's like, to break it, you have to start all over again, very slow. It's just, it's hard.
Absolutely. And bad habits, as you're saying, the power of bad habits is more powerful than the good habits. But what I want everyone listening to really kind of pay extra attention in what you're saying is the amount of self-discovery and self-discipline and the exploration of how to do things and to come up with answers for yourself. Within all, as you know, within all of the classical traditions, especially, there is so much kind of strict study and pedagogy where you're in this position of, okay, you do exactly this that the teacher says, then you do this, then you do that. And
Boxing.
so much of the time we're not actually coming up with the answers ourselves,
Yeah.
and we don't, you know.
And we don't know what it feels like either, right? They never tell you, look, when you start feeling this, pull back a little bit. They don't teach you that. They tell you, okay, go through these scales, these etudes, study the belay, the samandal, they go through all the storch, the storch harabi and all this stuff I got back here. And, the thing is, you have to, it's something, it's like life, right? You gotta grow. And it's like, what is it? You're not fully developed until your front lobe is completely developed, and that's like at age 27, right? For some cats. So it's in music, it's the same thing, right? We don't, separating the fun part and the creative, talented part that most of us musicians carry, because you have to be a crazy person to do this, right? You have to have this thing, right? Other than that, the thing we're talking about with technique is something, it's hard. Like, you start learning at a young age how to, like you said, refine, how to discipline yourself. And it takes a long time. For some musician, it starts very early, and for others, it starts very late. And it's a self gratifying moment, right? Because it's the first time where you actually, it's like really like putting a foot down and saying, okay, I got to focus on this. Let's do this.
Yeah, so I just to pick up on a couple of things. One is what you said about nobody can teach you how it feels, and I just think that's such a beautiful sentiment, because no one can get inside of that sensation that you have, and therefore it doesn't matter how intuitive or great a teacher is. If you're not trying to answer those questions for yourself, you can't.
Don't know.
You can't have that level of development. And yeah, it's
Crazy, right?
yeah, it's
I had my teacher. I had a great. Thank God, I had a great teacher named John Schaefer. Right, he was a part of the New York Phil from the late '40s all the way to the late '60s. And Tom Martin, as you know, Tom was someone who was well dear in my family. He's knew me as a young kid, and these cats, when they used to teach, at least with Tom and with Johnny, right? Whenever it became a bow situation, right? Anything with the bowing on, at least they were able to show me through physical feelings. Like, they would put their hand on my arm and stop me from pulling a down string, right? And they would say, "Do you feel that? You see the resistance? Now learn how to move my hand without moving your forearm." So at least in that sense, the old school way of teaching for bass kind of at an early age, it made me understand, okay, I gotta use my arm, I gotta use this weight. They would teach me about weight. It wasn't just a verbal thing. Like, they would get into it, be like, all right, push my arm while you play. And sometimes I couldn't do it, and they were like, I would feel their arm, and they would just like all of a sudden move my arm. So I was lucky enough to study that. And I think that could, old school way of teaching was very, hands on. This is what it's like. This is what it feels like. But maybe things have changed. I don't know, but I'm glad that
you do touch upon like a contentious but really interesting area, because my teaching, the best teaching that I had was exactly the same. That some of the most memorable things that I have that stuck with me and changed me from that moment onwards were when was a physical touch from somebody to make me understand how a certain weight feels, or a certain resistance, as you were saying, or certain softness or whatever. And it's a difficult thing for teachers, especially if they're teaching a lot of kids. There's all sorts of completely correct and absolutely understandable rules as to why you should or shouldn't do that kind of thing. But it's a tricky area with string playing and with instrumental playing generally, because it is so much about the sensation.
And if you could teach them at a young age, you could pick up real fast, and then it helps you as you grow, with your learning, because that lesson will stick to your head, and then you'll always, start figuring that stuff out. I mean, there were many lessons like that, and and as you get older, you start creating different ways to add to those lessons, and then you provide those to your student, hoping
Absolutely.
that they'll learn, figure it out.
So I wanted to ask you if you could share with us anything that has been a particular challenge for you, either physically or mentally, psychologically, like either over the years. Like, do you remember? I mean, you just actually gave us one example with like trying to learn that resistance with the arm,
Yeah.
but
Well, yeah, that's always been an issue. I mean, and I'm not, I've been playing jazz a long time, but my love for classical bass is, I got books back here on every Bottesini concerto and how I got one of his early books. So I'm a nerd when it comes to that stuff.
I know you are. I
But
know.
the one thing that I struggle with, and it's so out. It's so out. It's the reverse psychology of pulling a sound from my instrument. So, in other words, the physical part of the bow does not transcend to the meaning of sound because of how we, especially with the bass bow, how much bow you have to produce a sound. So we all know as string players, yeah, we could take the bow and we could just go and get the loudest sound, right? But you're only gonna have like maybe a half note, and then it's gonna stop, right? But you have music that have, you got footballs, a bunch of whole notes. How are you going to pull a sound without? So in my head, it's always been a psyche, right? It's been crazy because me being brute, I'm gonna, it's not like that, right? So it's like it's the opposite, right? It's like you gotta put weight on the string, and then your bow, the bow speed has to be much slower, right? And closer to the bridge. So it's like a whole technique, right? That you have to always understand. And I remember them teaching me years, always, long tones on the right on the bridge, as nasty as it could be, but hold it and try to keep it as even as you can, right? So, just recently, yesterday, I was dealing with a recording that had, it had a passage with a flute, with flutes and saxophones with the bow, and I'm thinking, and I'm it's only like three whole notes, but the tempo is like 1, 2, 3, 4, and my thing is like, I don't want to do another. I don't want to take another bow, right? Because that's like sometimes it's like that's ghetto, man. Don't do that. You should be able, right? If you've trained well, you should be able to play a nice bow slow with enough sound. But the physicality of the sound, right? It's reverse, right? Because you don't feel like you're doing much, but because of your weight on the string and the sound that's produced, it produces that energetic sound, but you don't feel like you're pulling that much sound. So it's mind boggling. So that's one thing that bothers me. And to this day, and it's going to be through, because the thing also is I don't do it much. Right. So when, it's like, hello, if you wanted to really get it right, just do it every day and you'll master it. But it's working with Winston is like that. I'll have a million notes as pizzicato and I'm nailing them, and then all of a sudden you turn the page and then you have a plethora of arco movements that he wrote, and I'm like, dude, you haven't written this in about 2 years, and all of a sudden now you're just throwing this at me. So it was just, I love that, because it keeps me well on my foot. But so that's one of the things, right, Nicky? And then the other ones are the physicality part, right? Playing bass has always been a torture for my back. And, I've had 2 back surgeries because of playing the bass and because of playing it the wrong way, and for the students that are listening and for the adults that are taking bass lessons or professionals, they know that the pelvis, when you play the bass, is offline, because it's just, you can't play the bass with a straight pelvis. There's always some type of unevenness, right? So we have to learn how to balance ourselves while we play the instrument. And that's a whole nother practice, because that's more of a feeling thing, right? Than music.
Yeah.
You're just holding the bass, And another thing we have to learn is about sizes, right? Just because you like a bass and you see it doesn't mean that it's going to work well with you. So it took me this long, I'm 41 now, to now understand that any bass that has an upper bout from 19-inch to 20-inch, I would be comfortable with. But when I was younger, I was playing basses with upper bouts that were 21, 22 inches, and it was the bass looked good because it was enormous, but it was killing my back. The breakover for my back was going nuts. So those are certain things that I struggle with, and I try to, again, with that whole talk of generalizing, trying to keep it around that point where I think I could succeed with it.
And what's so interesting is that when you're younger and have that level of talent that you had, that you have, but at that age, at young age, that you have this kind of you're bursting with talent, you can overcome all sorts of
Oh
stuff
yeah,
like that.
it doesn't phase you. You're just flying through it. Pain, there's no pain. You're like fine. The string length, that's another thing I started really focusing on. When I was younger, I mean, we were at, and I'm in inches, right? I'm going to be 43 inches, 44 inches, and for bass, the common goal now is 41 and a half to maybe 42. And if you say 42, people looking at you like, man, that's pretty long. That hand position is really, so it's crazy. And again,
I'm learning specifics about bass that I did not realize
it's
before.
crazy. It's crazy. Let's not even get to strings. Oh,
And what about from a more psychological perspective, like your mentality of playing? I mean, I just before you answer, I never forget hearing about the study that was done on the brains of classical and jazz musicians together, and how absolutely different parts of the brains were lighting up. And for us, what we talk about all the time as classical musicians is how creative or free actually are we when we're playing. And when I say free, I don't mean in a kind of like, oh, just do what you want kind of thing. I mean in the kind of, we're actually deciding ourselves to go in this direction or go in that direction. So either from a general, performance practice, general standpoint, do you have anything that you feel has been a particular challenge or developed for you psychologically? Or maybe you could say something about the differences between jazz and classical.
Well, I think the biggest challenge for me, I think to this day, has always been right hearing, right? Because we as musicians, we start learning that there's a canvas of sound, and in jazz, we take sound and we break them up in different options, right? Because sound in music repeats itself to a certain degree. Once you start learning the intricacies of it, you start saying, "Oh, yeah, C major, A minor. Wow, they have very similar stuff." Whoa, and it gets very intriguing, and at the same time, it gets very you start deciphering, like it's like a puzzle, right?
Right,
So
right.
for me as a jazz musician, we take sound, and in sound, we as a rhythm player, we have to detect certain options, right? And we have to use these certain options. The more we do it, the more we figure out which options are the best ones, right? So as you grow into it, you start, there's so many options, but you start picking out, okay, this one and this one, this combination is going to work great under this sound, and same thing for accompanying, same thing for soloing. And I think the difference between that and in classical music, which we also strive, is expression, is being free in expression, entering a realm of expressing music a certain way. So in jazz, we learn how to express through historical genres, right? Bebop era, right? The blues era, the big band era, the early New Orleans music era. There are many different ways of playing, ragtime, and we teach ourselves how to play through these eras. In classical music, there's a lot of emotional attachment to music and sound that is very, for me, has always been a very challenging thing, because you have to, like, it's like you have to channel your mind and your body towards whatever phrase you're playing, and everything that you have in your hands has to work so that you could produce this sound and this phrase that you're hearing. And I think that's mind-boggling, right? That's because it's not just you singing a phrase, right? Because it would probably be a little easier if you just sang the phrase. But now you have a bow, you have an instrument, right? And you have to, like, past that, through that, I call it the wall, right? I call it the wall because musicians, we have us, and then we have that of the instrument, and in between that is a wall, and we go through lessons, we study theory, history, to break down that wall so that we make this instrument as one, right? Which we probably, maybe the last day before we die, we end up becoming one, right? Because we're going to be working our behinds off just to do that every day. But Nikki, I think for me, it's always been that. It's always been hearing. Hearing's always been a challenge, right? Because in my lifetime as a musician, I'm sure you've seen many great musicians. There's so many different levels of hearing, and some. I mean, I've met some great musicians that can hear anything. I mean, the wind blows, and they already have a set of notes that came out of the sound of the wind that they heard. You see, and for me, it's always been a challenge because I've never been able to. I mean, my hearing has never been at that level, but at another, it's a different type of level. And I've always challenged myself, always been working hard to try to find those options, And that's, for
Well,
me, those are my.
I thank you very much for honestly sharing that with us. But I do just want to give context, which is how every single member of your band talks about your hearing. And I've heard many people talking about your hearing, like, this guy's hearing is unbelievable. So let's just put it like in context that the kind of hearing that you're critical of and that you want to improve, most of us would like literally die for. So just some context there for our listeners. So my last question, Carlos, and thank you for being so generous with all of what you've shared with us and with your time. The last question is just, do you have any, so taking part in this workshop over these few weeks are many different levels of, so some beginners and some adult learners and conservatoire students. So you can either like address one particular group, or do you have any general advice for everyone about your general relationship to your instrument and to developing both physically and psychologically?
Well, I'm gonna try to break it in parts. So for the young musicians, I would say dedicate your time to having fun, right? So what we need to do now that you're very young and that you're starting to play, just have fun. Play all the notes that you can, even if they're wrong. It doesn't matter. Enjoy playing that wrong note, right? Enjoy making that scratchy sound with the bow. Don't matter, right? Because the goal is to start loving this so that you could really become one with this instrument as you get older, right? Nobody's looking at you to become the next Paganini or the Bottesini on the instrument. We want you to love this. So that I would say all young musicians, love your instrument, right? Have fun with it. Don't break it, but you can play the wrong note, get that slide, scratch, and just enjoy it. Okay, now after a year or a couple, maybe 2 years of seeing that as a very young musician, then you slowly start trying to refine it a little bit, and you just take it in steps. Maybe just get rid of the scratchy bow, or let's start intonation. Let's start trying to tune one or two notes on the instrument. Now, when we get into that middle section of our lives, the intermediate level, that's when we have to start slowly, you know, enjoying ourselves, but through hearing. Hearing is a very crucial part of music, and I would try to um, give the notion to all musicians in the intermediate level to start focusing on their hearing. Hearing is something that we all musicians, jazz, classical, you name them, blues, whatever it is, we can't play music without hearing. And the more we work on hearing, trust me, at a younger age will definitely help. And then as you get older, you start really refining the techniques, scales, bow technique, the whole nine, posture, phrasing, historical phrasing, because that's a whole nother game, and as you get older, you start performing, then you start creating your own sound. Your own sound will be created as you start performing and as you start breaking up with all these great musicians that you will fall in love with sonically. You know, how many times I fell in love with Paul Chambers, Ray Brown, Bobby Rodriguez, Victor Venegas. I mean, you name them. And then at a certain point, I had to break up with them. Like sonically, I had to like, no, I can't play those parts like you do anymore because I gotta be me. I gotta do Carlitos. And then that's when you start using your mind and you start saying, okay, well, this person did this. I'm gonna do this a little different, maybe backwards. And then you start creating these formulas, and then all of a sudden it's Carlitos. They'll be like, oh yeah, Carlitos plays this all the time. I love it. And then another kid hopefully will fall in love with my sound. And then they'll break up with me and vice versa, and it'll just continue to change. So, that's all I could,
I
say.
I just I know I just love the patient development that you just laid out, because it doesn't happen in a day,
Oh, no.
and you can't have a formula for right now that's just going to fix all problems. And to relax into and enjoy that journey, because that's half of the fun of playing is to enjoy the development over time. Listen, thank you so much. I have learned so much in the last half an hour. I'm so grateful to you for chatting with us. And I hope we have you back again soon.
Yeah, we'll see each other. We'll play.
Yeah. Thank you, Carlos.
All right.